Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Robbins, and I'm Dean of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Happy Earth Day. Thank you enormously for joining us today. This is going to be good. I hope you've been enjoying the Earth Day so far. I've been checking in. We have 1,500 people out here in the room now. There's probably about 80 folks in the room joining us right now live. And of course, this will be available afterwards if you want to come back to the conversation. This session is going to be an opportunity for us to discuss with two leading experts how we can make an environmentally just transition with a focus on justice. And what does that look like? And how do we avoid getting it wrong? Is there a wrong way to do it? There's almost always a wrong way to do things. So to answer these questions, we're very excited to have with us today Rihanna Gunn-Wright and Kyle White. And before I tell you a little bit more about our speakers and get to the questions, I want to acknowledge that the city of Madison and the house in which I sit and the University of Wisconsin-Madison are located on ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Teejop since time immemorial. And in an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, land that they had stewarded for thousands of years, and which remains a vital part of their identity and heritage. We welcome our Indigenous partners and friends today and every day. The perspectives of these communities are hugely valued here on campus, especially as we delve into this very challenging topic. Now, our guests. Rihanna Gunn-Wright is the Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute. And before joining Roosevelt, Rihanna was the policy director for the New Consensus, which was charged with developing and promoting the Green New Deal, among other projects. And in addition, Rihanna is a 2013 Rhodes Scholar and previously worked as the policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department. And she was a Miriam K. Chamberlain Fellow of Women in Public Policy at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And she served on the policy team for the former First Lady, Michelle Obama. Welcome, Rihanna.
It's an honor to be here.
Oh, no. I was just telling Rihanna that on her slowest day, she's faster than I am by 5 times. Kyle White, our other guest, is the George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Prior to this role, Kyle was Professor of Philosophy and Community Sustainability and Timnick Chair at Michigan State University. Kyle's research addresses moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. He is also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Welcome, Kyle.
Thank you, Paul, and good to be here with Rihanna as well.
So I'm going to get to you quickly, so just a tiny bit of housekeeping. For the first part of the session, I'm going to ask you questions. These folks will answer, taking whatever time they'd like, and then really asking about what a just transition looks like. And then we're going to go and open it up to questions live in the chat box. So somewhere around 40 minutes past, if you've got questions, pop them in there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One last bit of housekeeping. If you are in need of closed captioning for this session, you'll find a link in the description of the video, which links to stream text for our live captioner. All right, let's get to the guests. Kyle, Rihanna, can you share with us what your definition of a just transition is? What does it look like? And how has your experience informed your thinking on the topic? And we'll start with Kyle.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And, for me, a just transition is one where the entire hierarchical, oppressive situation that characterizes the current energy system is over. It's one where, speaking, for my own community, where Indigenous people are in leadership positions, where people of color are in leadership positions, where the actual energy technologies and how they're used and how labor is related to those technologies comes out of our cultural and ethical visions for what it means to treat each other well, but also the best ways to and most respectful ways to treat the environment.
That's great. Thank you. Rihanna?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of my work I tend to think about the climate crisis from sort of an economic perspective. And so for me, the definition of a just transition um, is along the lines of what Kyle said, but I guess adding on to that also a transition where workers and communities that have been dependent on fossil fuel industries, largely because not of decisions of their own, are not forced to pay for the transition away from fossil fuels. And instead, we really front load the costs of those transitions on the industries that are responsible for where we are now, particularly fossil fuel industries. And a just transition, I think, of as also one in which the transition away from fossil fuels, along the lines of what Kyle said, fuels a renegotiation of power relationships in our economic and political and social world, so that we do not end up in essentially a form of green capitalism, very similar to what we have now. But instead, the transition fuels um, greater power for communities that have been left out, new opportunities for ownership, new stakes, new ownership stakes, new stakes in leadership, such that we don't end up in a situation where it's green, but it's still an economy that's based on the domination of people of color, largely by white people, and outsized power for corporations over communities, and where there's also a real uptick in democratic control over public investment um, and public resources.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that sets us in the right direction for the rest of the conversation. So my follow-up then is like policy, kind of wonky. If you could make policy, let's say you had a limited number of political chips, and you really wanted to pick, say, two key lead policies that really set the right stage for this. What would they be? Two is like more than one, but less than infinity. It was an arbitrary number, but I just imagine that you can't do everything. Where do you start? So I'll start with Kyle. Should I start with Kyle?
Yeah. So right now, one of the developments within the Biden-Harris administration is an emphasis on environmental justice, and it's across several executive orders that were given immediately in January. And part of it reflects the fact, and I do hope that many Democrats continue to appreciate this, that how hard people of color worked to win the election on behalf of the Democrats. And some of the motivation for this explicit commitment to environmental justice, I think, is an attempt of privileged Democrats to reckon with the fact that their victory was on the backs and through the hard work of people of color. And a couple of specific items about environmental justice. So one of the initiatives that the Biden administration is rolling out is called Justice 40. They're going to look at the entire set of investments in sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy and other areas that the federal government is going to commit to. So billions of dollars. 40% of that is literally supposed to benefit communities affected by environmental justice. 40% of that. That is a very targeted and directed infrastructure investment that has to relate immediately to the issues, concerns, aspirations of underserved communities who are facing inequalities and injustices tied to their relationship to the environment. What I'm really worried about on the policy side is that people get so caught up in what they call the high level aspects of the policies, the funding allocation. But that's not what's going to count here. We've been waiting for the high level work for many, many decades, right? So the emphasis shouldn't be placed on the fact that that's the part where all our energy needs to focus on. At a policy level, we need to ensure that when federal agencies and officials carry out these investments, that they don't simply do what's typically happens with infrastructure investments, which is the money mysteriously flows out of the actual communities. And so there need to be strong policies on, community ownership of infrastructure, of actual capacity in the community, labor capacity, right, work capacity, leadership capacity, educational capacity for the infrastructure. And very explicitly, the federal government needs to take very seriously what role the knowledge that communities have plays in the infrastructure planning and the allocation of infrastructure and every single aspect of what it means to transform the infrastructure to the benefit of communities affected by environmental justice. And this is not community input. It's not just participation. It's knowledge, community experience, community testimony. And so there has to be a way for these critical aspects to be better articulated within the policy approaches that are currently being emphasized within the Biden-Harris administration.
That's great. Thank you. I kind of have to think about how that gets operationalized. Don't answer that. Let's go, because that's right. Let's go to Rihanna. What are you thinking in public policy?
Yeah, so if I had to pick two policies, the first is going to be the role of financial regulators enforcing a transition away from fossil fuels. Because right now we're in a situation where we are truly relying on the market, along with public investment that, particularly that's outlined in the American Jobs Plan, to sort of facilitate and fuel that transition. But right now, there is no plan for how we're going to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We're just, the Biden-Harris administration calls it a market-based transition to renewable energy. But the issue there is that we know that fossil fuel companies are not going to pull themselves offline when they need to, and likely they're going to try to extend the length of their tenure as far as possible, even when it is actually creating great risk and harm for our economic system. And right now, we're seeing fossil fuel companies put out net zero pledges, for instance, but those are toothless, right? No one is enforcing those. No one is holding them to those. No one is actually going to make sure that they do those things. And so there's actually a role for financial regulators when you are thinking about what's called the sort of quote unquote carbon bubble, which is the risk that stranded assets, that fossil fuels pose to both the economic health of the United States, but global economic health. And regulators have a responsibility to move on that proactively. And in doing so, to essentially create sort of a public sector, if not led, but at least mapping of a transition out of fossil fuels by the public sector. And we have the tools to do that. Like Dodd-Frank put in place a set of macroprudential tools actually for this very situation where there is sort of an oncoming economic crisis, so that financial regulators can get in front of it and that we don't have a replay of 2008 or 2009. And the carbon bubble, by the way, would be much bigger than the housing bubble should it burst. So that's one thing. And the other reason that you would really want the public sector involved is because we see what is going to happen to workers if there is no public involvement in the wind down of fossil fuel industries. We are seeing what happens with coal bankruptcies. People's pensions disappear, right? Those workers are left, in the wind. And there's no regulation, there's no support for them. So there's really no reason to believe that when we don't use oil in the same way, when we don't use gas in the same way, when we don't use coal in the same way, that these companies are going to act responsibly towards those workers and not just act out of shareholder primacy and try to protect their profits and their CEOs and whatnot. So I think that is the first sort of it's not a single policy, but I think the set of policies that Dodd-Frank lays out can easily be used by financial regulators to just really more proactively force disinvestment in fossil fuels and really try to figure out what is a way to let the air out of the carbon bubble in a way that is the least harmful for people and communities and workers. And then I think the second thing that I would add for just transition, and again, it's not really a single policy because we haven't really thought a lot about it. At least I haven't heard people thinking about it a lot, is how to replace state revenue for fossil fuel dependent states. So there's, I think, about 9 states that are really dependent on fossil fuel revenue. So as those industries wind down, their tax revenues are hurt. And states are not like the federal government. They cannot make money, right? They are very bound by what they can get through tax revenue is essentially, and federal funding is what states can do. That is the bucket of money that they can use to provide goods and services. And so I think we really have to think proactively about what is the role of the federal government in stepping in and helping to fill in those tax revenues, as well as what are the ways that the federal government, along with states, can really proactively think about economic development in terms of what industries can we seed in place of the industries that are going away. How do we sort of fill in that revenue organically, as well as how does the federal government sort of backstop that through some set of funding until those revenues are filled in?
That's great. So I'm hearing about community control and financial instrument and redistributive and developmental justice in this unevenness of transition. That's practical. My next question has kind of been answered, which is sort of how could we get the Green New Deal wrong? And the things that I'm getting from both of you are, well, if we wind up sort of back where we are, except with solar panels. I have a fairly specific concern around this, which is that the actual technologies, it's ecology 101. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So I have a deep concern about climate colonialism. And here I just mean the acquisition of land and resources from marginalized, historically colonized, currently colonized, poorer parts of the world to serve ostensibly, right, green ends in wealthy nations or places. So as we move to build out green infrastructure, I mean, if you just think about what goes into a solar panel, which is to say a lot of stuff from Central Southern Africa and a lot of labor in China, like what does that look like? How do we make this, how do we get that right? And I'll start with Kyle.
Yeah, Paul, a couple items on that. One, taking a brief step back on the Green New Deal part. There are serious infrastructure questions that aren't on enough people's mind regarding the energy transition. So, for example, a lot of people are unaware of what the current infrastructure overall status is on most Indian reservations, for example, are affecting diverse indigenous people in other situations. And because a lot of people don't know about this, and a colleague of mine, Catherine Sandoval, has written excellent work on this topic, that there are actually barriers to implementing renewable energy when there's all sorts of other infrastructure aspects that need to be addressed, issues with roads, issues with other things that you would need to actually put a project in place. And even if people are aware of that, though, there has to be the coordination to do everything in an efficient way, right? If you're going to do a huge intervention, that a tribe is leading, you don't want to have everything disorganized, which could create a logistical nightmare and mean that a lot of the benefits aren't realized. And there's been similar issues in other areas where I think people get the impression that if you sort of provide the funds and if you sort of have the idea and the vision, then it will simply manifest with a little bit of tribal leadership and indigenous leadership within it. But it's just not true, because we're still owed decades of backlog in infrastructure inequity, and that stuff stacks up. It's not related, and it's not going to go away. And these are issues that affect people's health, their cultural vitality, issues tied to their education, their careers, and so on. And so I'm very much worried that we're facing this other backlog, which is that people still haven't made up for the learning that they should have done a couple hundred years ago. And that's going to come back to bite us very severely as some of these large infrastructure investments begin to roll out. Now, in terms of the point about global environmental injustice, a couple of contextual points in terms of how I approached that question. And Native North Americans have been among those calling out that exact issue, that people still aren't thinking enough, some people, about supply chain issues and the inequities in the supply chain that are associated with renewable energy technologies and other efficient technologies. And here's the thing, the United States, environmentalism in the United States, and I know many of our audience members are aware of this, is a very particular type of environmentalism that brought the world, highly inequitable forms of conservation tied to park systems and conservation zones. They were established here in the US context by displacing Native people and committing violence against Native people. And then they were exported everywhere else in other nation states and large conservation organizations with deep ties to American and European financial networks wreaked the same violence on Indigenous people and many, many other communities. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that in every other part of the world, environmental justice is the dominant form of environmentalism and has been for some time. It's just in the United States that privileged people suppressed the environmental justice activism that had been going on for decades, for centuries, depending on how you count it. And because the United States has still not reckoned with how deeply baked in that highly problematic conservation culture is, then many people who think they're beyond it are not beyond it. And they're buying into certain schemes regarding carbon markets and other solutions to climate change that rely on some of these strategies and tactics you're referencing that would occur in Africa, in Asia, in Central and South America, in the Pacific, in other parts of the world. And they have no idea that, and they need to really be familiar with this, right? That these technologies and these solutions, they're being implemented on top of other situations where there's generations of institutional inequity. They're not simply emerging as solutions in a vacuum. They're emerging into institutional contexts where even if it's a nation that was, liberated from European colonialism, that in terms of Indigenous people and other groups, their consent still doesn't matter. Their economic well-being still doesn't matter. And they haven't even established those nation states institutions that could even deliver right relations in the implementation of conservation areas, in forest conservation projects, and other types of renewable energy, or in the actual supply chain, the actual minerals and so on required for technologies that countries like the United States would implement. And so for me, we really need to be very sobering about the fact that we're not even close to where we need to be, just at a mental level, I think, in a country like the United States. And I don't think that should be something that discourages people, but it is the job that needs to be done. And we're just not as far along as we need to be.
Great. Thank you. Rihanna, your thoughts on questions?
Yeah, I agree with Kyle. And when people ask me that, I often wonder, like, I understand why we go to climate colonialism, but like Kyle said, there is a way to be engaged in trade relationships that are in right relationship, right? When we trade with Britain or France, right, it is not an issue of colonialism because it is essentially two equals, right, negotiating on, with one another on, on behalf of their public interest. And with, sort of developing nations, a lot of times they are forced into exploitative relationships by by these sort of big global entities like the IMF, like the World Bank, that, you know, require them to be open to relationships that are not beneficial to them. And so in lots of ways, one way that you get rid of that, and like Kyle said, it's not easy because you are dealing with sometimes issues of the infrastructure might not exist, partially because of colonialism. Well, actually, almost entirely because of colonialism, and the ways that we have engaged before. But still, I think if the US took a stance of actually the folks who have those resources, you decide the terms upon which trade is fair, right? You decide the terms. We are not forcing you to do something. And I think that stance can go a long way because we are in a situation that is very unfortunate because we have delayed for so long. We're like, we need those technologies. We need those solar panels. We need those materials. And it's not just that the US needs it, but the US, like personally, but we need it so that we can stop contributing to harm in other nations, right? Every year that we delay, we're essentially borrowing time from developing nations. And so the sooner that we stop doing that, it's just a complex problem. The sooner we stop doing that, the less that we borrow their time, we put them in a bad situation. While at the same time, that means that we're reliant on a lot of materials from those places that are being forced into these exploitative relationships. So I do think it is, though, on the US to essentially try, not even try, but to take the stance of like, you are setting the terms upon which we are engaging in this relationship. The US is not setting the terms, and nor are we using our role in, the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank to continue to force these nations into exploitative relationships. I think we have a responsibility to in our place there, because we have such an outsized role, to force relationships that don't leave those countries open to exploitation the way that they are right now. And I know it sounds a bit Pollyannish, but I don't know how else you start unless you start from not being a jerk. Like, I don't. If you don't start from there, I'm not sure exactly where else you start.
Right, and that leans back on Kyle's point about just elevating the awareness of those relationships and those histories. So those are super compelling answers, and gave me some things to think about, especially the way we frame these things. I mean, I do throw the term climate colonialism around a lot, and I think there's obviously more to it than that. So great. All right. I'm going to go break out a little bit about some separate projects. Our keynote speaker tonight, so everybody in the room knows who's here live, is Ayana Johnson, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who's co-editor of this book, All We Can Save. So for the 150 people or whoever are out there on YouTube, you still have between now and, 6 o'clock to go to a local, family-owned book establishment or a library and get a hand on this thing, and you can at least get through, 40 pages. So, and you know who's in here, right? Rihanna is in here. So the question I have is, what attracted you to participate in the project? How did you get in? How were you enrolled in this? It's super cool, everybody. There's essays in here. There's poetry. It's all women. So tell me about it a little bit.
So, I mean, it's not that exciting of an answer. Ayana and I had an existing relationship. So the All We Can Save book is part of a larger All We Can Save Now. It's a nonprofit that's focused on feminist climate leadership. And one of the first things that they did, actually, before they started, the nonprofit is have a gathering of feminist climate leaders in Montana. And so I knew Ayanna a little bit before then. She was actually weighing in on Green New Deal policy as it related to oceans and ocean agriculture or aquaculture. And so she invited me to Montana. We all got to know each other a lot better. And then they asked me to contribute an essay on the Green New Deal. And I was incredibly excited because I think something that Kyle has been pointing to a lot that is true is that a lot of what we need to get out of the place that we are is different approaches to leadership and different kinds of thought, right? One of the reasons, I think a big reason that we're here is a real reliance on a technocratic approach to climate policy that is quite based in patriarchy and white supremacy, and all sorts of other ills. And unless we are listening to folks who have different types of knowledge and different ways of approaching the problem, whether that's indigenous knowledge or feminist, sort of feminist perspectives or environmental justice perspectives, then we're not going to get very far, because a lot of what the Green New Deal is about, I think if you really break it down to its most basic level, is about a different kind of world building. And so you have to be able to think differently about the world if you want to build a different type of world. And so I was really excited that they were bringing in a feminist perspective because I hadn't seen that a ton. And definitely not organized in this type of project. And I was really attracted to, like you said, there's poems. I think there's illustrations too throughout the book. So there's a real emphasis on different ways of both communicating about the climate crisis, but understanding the situation that we're in and responding to it, right? Because the climate crisis is emotional too. And in a lot of ways, for a lot of folks, it's spiritual. It's not just a matter of greenhouse gas emissions and parts per million and increases in temperature. Those are important, but there's so many other aspects to it that I think if we don't grasp and if we don't meet people there, it becomes very difficult to move forward.
That's great. You want to follow up there? Or did I cut you off?
No, I'm done.
That's really great. I got to say, my colleagues in environmental science, there are moments when you're in the room and you feel genuine despair. I mean, it's kind of a spiritual, experiential situation. So
Yeah.
thinking differently and approaching this, not just from your head, I suppose, it's really critical. So I hear you. And that's true about policy. It must be true about policymakers too. I mean, that must be.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. A lot gets lost in policy because people want to treat it like a science fair. Right? Where like you just gather your facts and that's what it is about. When policy is no less a political process than anything else. You are arguing over what is the problem, because unless you can establish something as a public problem, you can't move on it, right? Which is why fossil fuel disinformation has been so powerful, right? They didn't, they didn't just try to stop the gathering of facts. They tried to literally contest that this is a problem that exists. Because if you can keep us arguing about if this is real or not, you don't even have to talk about what to do about it. Right? You just stay in that place. They really attacked our ability to even establish it as a problem. And, and so I think, and especially when so much of policy depends on votes and who's in office, the ability to think about policy as something that relates to people's emotional lives, to their dreams about themselves, to the types of communities they want to live in, you really have your hands tied behind your back, particularly if you are not, not the GOP, which is like flush with cash, right? And supported by lots of rules that make minority rule more easier, and whatnot, then I think you have a particularly difficult issue.
Thanks. That's super helpful. Kyle, I see you have been recently appointed to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. That acronym, I pronounce it as WEJAC. I don't know if that's right. The Advisory Council is going to provide advice and recommendations on how to address current and historic environmental injustices, what we've been talking about, what you've been pointing to, which is obviously pretty exciting. Obviously, the question is what attracted you to the project? I mean, it's kind of obvious, I guess, but I'm kind of interested if you have concerns. Like, I'm always interested in what can go wrong. I don't know what my problem is. It's a political ecology thing. So how do you feel about it, and what direction do you want to see it go?
Yeah, and just a quick shout out to those great points Rihanna just made, which I really appreciated all the way through. In terms of the White House Council, so a few items on that. So it's the first time there's been a council that predominantly consists of community leaders that's in the White House, and we have right now 3 charges. One charge is the Justice 40 initiative, is to advise on how that 40% I talked about earlier is going to be allocated, and we're going to be tackling those specific issues I mentioned. The second thing is we're going to upgrade Executive Order 12898, which is the Environmental Justice Executive Order from 1994 that was a product of people of color organizing going back many decades. And the last thing is we're going to work to improve screening tools for environmental justice, including layers tied to climate change. So how can it go wrong? Well, yeah, I mean, well, a lot of ways, but what I would say to kind of split the difference on your question, Paul, is that all the people on this council are people who have experienced every which way of how policy gets it wrong. I mean, people with decades of experience having to navigate those issues on behalf of the communities that they serve. And so we're really approaching this, at least in my opinion, from that perspective, right? This is not the council of here are ideas, let's see what happens. This is the council of we know 1,000 ways that this goes wrong. How do we build in policy transformations that will do better to avoid those goings wrong, or whatever the proper way to articulate that is. And just a quick note, I hope everybody attends our public meetings. We have our next one coming up on Wednesday at 1:00 Eastern time. You can go to our webpage to find the Zoom information. There'll be another meeting on May 13th, and we're working hard on the first draft of recommendations on the 3 areas that I mentioned.
Great. Yeah. So for everybody who's taking notes and wants to drop in, that is the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, WHEJAC. All right. We're going to move to questions from the audience. We got some good ones. What they'll do is they'll feed me, and I'll spit them out, and I'll give you guys a chance to answer. The first question is really about energy consumption. We've talked a lot about trading out one technology for another and building infrastructure and doing it in a just way and addressing historic injustice. But what about energy consumption levels in the West? The West, that's how the question is phrased. Maybe we'll start with Kyle and then go back to Rihanna.
I'd like to go a bit philosophy on that. And, there's a ton of ways to talk about, energy consumption. And so kind of a philosophical way is that, I think that I see so many of us, right, that some of the ways we enjoy life, including through the arts, including the things we require to do our work, are all pretty energy intensive and require certain types of technologies. And, it comes to things like movies or, computers, what we're doing right now, there's kind of this taken for granted assumption that those are all, the main ways to, have positive experiences and creative experiences. But we're really operating with a pretty narrow definition of energy. And one of the things I'm most disappointed about in the various fields that study energy is they still just assume like one definition of what energy is. For any indigenous people, thousands throughout the world, like we had our own conceptions of energy, and they weren't consumptive-based conceptions of energy. Like we understood energy through kinship relationships, through connections to flows within the environment, to seasonal dynamics, to a constantly moving environment. And just speaking here for Potawatomi and Anishinaabe people, and so I think when we think about those energies, those types of energy, and how different they are, and that you can actually think of world-changing motion that's put in place just by social relationships, by ceremonial relationships. You can think of artistic and creative practices and ones that are things that people do together. They orchestrate together, not an individual interface with an energy-intensive technology. And that creates a really different way of thinking. And, building on Rihanna's point about the Green New Deal involving a different way of thinking, not just a different way of thinking, like just a really different way of thinking. And so I think our conversations about consumption also need to have this philosophical aspect to it if they're ultimately going to be meaningful. We have to get away from ethnocentric understandings of energy and recognize the plurality of understandings of energy, and how dialogue about that plurality could potentially change some of our values, and even change the sanctity of some of those things that we like to do that seem so important. And I know I have a bit of a consumer-oriented focus on that, and certainly, if those of you who've seen the rest of my work know that I'm not placing the blame on on individuals as the key pivotal point. But I do think these cultural and philosophical considerations have a place in this discussion.
That's great. Rihanna, you want to respond to the question, or to Kyle, or?
Yeah, no, I think Kyle is right. I think one thing that we didn't touch on is the role of energy efficiency in a transition towards clean energy. And that is a huge aspect, not just changing our source of energy, but reducing the amount of energy that we use. And I think particularly in ways that don't rely on individual action. There's so many ways that like our buildings bleed energy, right? Just thinking about our appliances bleed energy, right? And so I think energy efficiency in ways that sort of change the physical environment, change the basis of things that we're interacting with, is very important. And then I also think that it's important to recognize that the West isn't a block in the sense of energy consumption is more for people with concentrated wealth, right? People who are low income do not use the same amount of energy, in part because they cannot afford to. They literally cannot afford to. And so I just think that it's that distinction is important, because again, it brings us back to thinking about inequities in income and wealth, and the ways that shapes behavior, and the ways that actually attacking those inequities can play a role in driving down consumption. And I just think that it's important too, because I don't know, I think that when I think about particularly people in frontline communities, I think we have to understand too where consumption comes from, right? In the sense of when life is hard, sometimes you just want to watch the movie, or you just want to binge Netflix. And so there has to be an understanding of the way that consumption is also shaped by oppression and by access, and is an aspirational activity, and some grace and understanding there.
That's great. All right. Thank you. So here's a question. I guess the panel kind of answered this question through its very existence. But could the panel please address the recurrently raised, even if flawed, argument that we, quote, can't solve the climate crisis, unquote, if we, quote, divert ourselves to solve white supremacy, racism, sexism, capitalism, patriarchy, and so on. My first question for you, I suppose, relating off of that is, do you hear that? I mean, do people
Oh
say that?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
So
my.
how do you respond? How do you get back to that?
I'll spare you, Kyle, because I spent too much of my life answering this question. So right after the Green New Deal came out, first 6 months, I was asked this question nonstop. And it wasn't just from, folks who are oppositional, it was from long-term environmentalists, folks in the climate fight, who literally told me that the climate crisis is already hard enough. Why would you add in all of these other things? It's just going to make it harder. And it's just going to divert attention. I had someone actually write me like a 5-page essay about how the Green New Deal's focus on racial equity was actually unjust because people of color in the US were doing better than people of color in developing nations. And if we lost our fight for climate policy, it would be our fault for including racial equity. So yeah, this comes up less so now, but my pushback is always there is no way to understand the crisis without understanding white supremacy, racism, sexism, capitalism, all of that, because that is the basis of the climate crisis. That is what fueled the climate crisis. So for instance, I often ask people like a counterfactual, which is that, do you think that the US would still be using fossil fuels without limit and without any sort of legal consequence if peaker plants were distributed equally by race, right? If white children were getting asthma from fossil fuel facilities at the same rate, if we had just equally distributed it, do you think we would still be using fossil fuels? And the answer is almost always no. Because when those fights have come up, say, for instance, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, when it was first routed through I want to say Bismarck, but don't quote me. But I'm pretty sure it's Bismarck, where the population is like 90% white upwards. They had 1 or 2 town hall meetings, and all of a sudden it was rerouted through indigenous land, even though it was in violation of I don't know how many treaties, right? Without that loophole, what would have happened? Where would that have gone? And the fact is, when there are, we can even talk about NIMBY, not in my backyard, where people just don't want transmission cables behind their homes because it makes the property look bad and it will bring down property values. Those are by and large wealthy or upper middle class white communities. And we are now talking about NIMBYism as if it is a huge barrier to the adoption of renewables. Whereas if it was a Black community and they didn't want wires, do you think we would even care? Right. And so the fact is, all of these power differentials deeply shape the climate crisis and the way that we have used fossil fuels. And similarly with sexism, one of the reasons that the fossil fuel transition, the transition away from fossil fuels has been slow is because of the quality of fossil fuel jobs, right? They earn on average something like $100,000. They're highly unionized. The benefits can be great, even if there's occupational safety or health hazards to the workers. And that has made it difficult because, green jobs are not necessarily as unionized. They don't have that long legacy of worker power. And so people have real questions, right? Very real and well-deserved questions about what happens to those workers. But the fact is, if those industries were not predominantly white men, would they even have that money, pay level, benefits in the first place? Probably not. Look at what happens when fields are majority women, right? If they made as much as care workers, we would not be having such a difficult discussion, right? And so everything about the way that our energy system is structured, and thus what has fueled the climate crisis, everything about the way our economy is structured is shaped by those things. So if you think that it is possible to solve the climate crisis without addressing those, I am afraid that you are very naive.
That's a pretty good answer. Kyle, you want to add anything?
I will stay spared. I enjoyed Rihanna's responses and agree.
All right. So the next questions are sort of about like concrete examples or models for moving forward. So I think that folks are always like thinking about what it could look like by actually existing sustainability, just sustainabilities all around us or in some corners of the world. So the first question is for Kyle, are there some resources to learn about examples or new forms of conservation that aren't rooted in displacement? So what resources? I've got an answer to that question, actually. But Kyle, other ways of thinking about conservation that are not rooted in the colonial Yellowstone model or the extractivist model.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd encourage, I'll just answer briefly because it's a Googleable, it's not, I'll give some advice on what to Google. So pretty much if you look at most types of environmental efforts that indigenous people developed and created, you'll see that thinking. So check out what's available online if you look up First Nations or tribal national parks, and check out an article called Native Enclosures by Clint Carroll. And you can check out YouTube as well. When Native people do conservation, wow, it's it's different, and it gets at all the things that many of us recognize are important for changing our relationship to the environment, the politics, the ethics, the values, the cultural linguistic aspects. So check that out. And more tribes and First Nations and other indigenous people are getting involved in this movement. And I think it's pretty inspiring. So good luck on good luck on the internet.
Great. And for those of you around Wisconsin, I would start with the Menominee Forest. I mean, that's a model that is extractive and yet the last old growth forest left in the state that we now call Wisconsin. Rihanna, any thoughts on that? That one pointed at Kyle, but
No.
no. All right, so maybe I'll throw this one to you though, Rihanna, and it's kind of a similar question, but it's more about pilots that can give us hope or examples of the kind of change that you'd like to see, like maybe outside of conservation, but around some of these questions of energy or any of the kinds of problems you've identified. Do you see like real examples?
Yeah, I mean, and they're not even pilots. So thinking about an organization like Push Buffalo or We Act for Environmental Justice in Brooklyn, right? Those are examples of organizations that actually do take federal grants related to energy efficiency or renewable energy, housing retrofits, weatherization, and employ local community members and train them to do those jobs. And in doing so, actually, like Kyle said, provide a counterfactual to what happens to infrastructure funding, where the funding doesn't flow out. It is very clear how it is invested in the community and how it, it actually supports the goals of something that like a Justice 40 espouses. So I think, and in so many places, environmental justice activists and advocates are actually doing the kinds of things that we're talking about. So also like Uprose in Brooklyn is involved in the project for offshore wind in New York State. And I can't remember, I think I only know like the littlest bit about it, but there's the plan to convert Rikers Island. Isn't it Rikers in New Jersey? I might be getting it wrong. But there's a plan to essentially convert a very large prison into a space that does renewable energy and that generates energy for the local community. And so I think there's a lot of examples of that, of the ways that the ways that it can go well with infrastructure, public infrastructure investments and public funding. But I think those examples also, if you talk to, say, folks at Push Buffalo, there's also tons of lessons to be learned about what is necessary at the local level in terms of infrastructure to take in these massive investments and turn them into something that is productive for communities.
Great, thanks. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so we're in the lightning round. I got just a couple more left. Kyle, this one's just thrown to you because, White House, I guess. Biden's announcement on cutting emissions by 50% by 2030 in less than 9 years. Quick response. How does it make you feel?
It's pretty scary because if we imagined the end of that time period, what are our tribal economies going to look like? What guarantees are there that there's going to be a difference there? So that's my lightning response.
That's great. Thank you. I got one here, which comes back to your point, Rihanna, on fair trade and not being a jerk. So America, don't be a jerk. What does that really look like in terms of trade policy? I don't know a lot about trade policy. It's not my area, but it seems to me that you got an extractivist model and a dependency relationship, as we used to call it in the 1990s. So how do you break that at the federal level?
I'm not a trade expert, so I don't know exactly how to do that. So I would have to really sort of ask my colleague Todd Tucker at Roosevelt. So look out for that. I think we might be doing some work on that later. But I think in general, I think one way to do so is that right now, the Biden-Harris administration is talking about environmental justice a lot, but the way that we think about that is incredibly domestic. And so expanding that framework of environmental justice to our relationships internationally and the ways that we're engaging on climate and supply chain issues, I think is one step, because I think people understand that framing, but right now they're just thinking about it in a US context.
That's super helpful. Regional trade blocs can have environmental side agreements, for example, I guess. So going back now, I've got the Green New Deal has been demonized and mischaracterized by opposition parties. Is there a bipartisan path to achieving the sort of transformation that's been discussed? Is there a way to get around what we understand to be partisan politics in this space? Maybe we start with whoever's got the guts to answer that.
Well, I mean,
that's what you don't get, isn't that right? Sorry, Kyle, you go, and then you go, Rihanna. Yeah. We're out of time, just about.
Super quickly, it goes back to Rihanna's response to the question about racism. If a huge part of the GOP is driven by racism, and that's one of the biggest obstacles blocking these types of reforms, then it's not going to be possible unless racism is dealt with.
Rihanna, anything further to say?
Yeah, no, I agree. I would also say there's the issue of money in politics too, right? The GOP is very reliant on fossil fuel industries for donations, is very tied into the Koch brothers. And so part of a bipartisan path is in breaking those linkages in terms of money in politics. And then I'll say, but along with Kyle, I think the impetus for bipartisanship is on the GOP, right? Like it is on them to have an idea about climate crisis, and it is on them to deal with the racism in their base and in their party. Not that it's just their problem, but I just think that bipartisanship is not a matter of sort of begging the right to move, but rather the right trying to be in right relationship with these issues.
Thanks. That's very helpful. As were your remarks previously about taking really seriously workers in sectors and areas that are going to move through transition, because I think there's a lot of lip service to that. Like, oh, we'll just retrain people. But that's, easy for you to say. Like, you're not the one getting retrained. So I thought that sort of gets there too in terms of a larger tent, right? So we're down to 1 minute. Last thoughts on these questions. We'd like to lead the audience. We've got a couple hundred people out there. So Kyle, quickly.
I encourage everybody, keep the energy up, get out there, work hard, call out all of these horrible issues that we've discussed, keep the pressure on, just stay motivated.
Rihanna?
Yeah, I would say that recognizing that it's easy to get discouraged, but we have to deal with these issues whether we want to or not. They're coming our way. And so when work has to be done, it has to be done. And the more you work, the less you worry.
All right. So thanks to Kyle and Rihanna. As you can see, they're busy working. So the fact that they took an hour and a half out for us and the community, thank you. And thank you everybody who joined us. We had a really good crowd here today. Please participate in the live Zoom discussion this afternoon and join us for our keynote with Dr. Johnson, who was mentioned earlier, at 6:30 Central Time back at the Earth Day site. Thank you both. Keep up the good work. I hope to see you again soon.
And
Thanks,
don't forget to buy the book, All We Can Save.
At your local bookstore.